So, Fabian, on today's episode of Saka's Is That So, we're going to talk about the misconceptions surrounding the nonprofit sector. And one of the misconceptions around it is, what exactly is a nonprofit organization? Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. A lot of people, I think, when they think nonprofit, think about the soup kitchen, very much a charity doing direct delivery. And that's certainly one type, but there's a lot of different types. So if you think about the climate change process, you've got Extinction Rebellion, a lot of organizations entering the public sphere, and they'll probably do that as a nonprofit. You also have a number that will almost be like consultants to the big aid agencies. And so you have organizations like TechnoServe, DAI, et cetera, that'll sit there and really make sure that the big development work around the world gets done and gets done to a professional level. You've got foundations such as the one I work for that are working for a philanthropist, helping make sure the best organizations receive the support. And then you have categories like social enterprises, organizations that run like businesses, they make revenues, they make sort of pseudo profits. But are involved in doing so either as a not-for-profit or a very low-profit organization. In fact, my early career was spent in healthcare, working in healthcare analytics, and we were doing that for the public sector, and we were structured as not-for-profit. So you can have quite a few different flavors.
So in terms of all the different types of nonprofits that you can have, it sounds like some of them actually do have some profit motive in order to, keep the lights on and, have enough revenue to solve some of the world problems that are out there. So there might be a business incentive as opposed to the misconception out there, which is, we're all just trying to save the world. We don't actually need to make money. It's not that important. It's not about the money, but it is actually a very important part of it, right?
Money is definitely a massive element of the sector, and you can be fundraising for that money. So looking for donors or aid agencies to pay your way, or you can try to make it in the market. And that's been a real trend, I think, over the last 5 to 10 years, as a number of organizations have said, if we're going to be able to do what we do sustainably, for example, we work with an organization in East Africa that helps smallholder farmers get access to improved seeds and fertilizer. And they've realized that if they gave it away, A, they wouldn't be sustainable, and B, their recipients would be recipients rather than customers. And so they charge for their product. It's still subsidized by donors such as ourselves, but they run themselves like a business, and that pseudo profit motive really does help. As a non-profit, you can't return money to your shareholders. So you don't call it a profit, but you can have a surplus that you are then required to reinvest in your services in future years.
Speaking of organizations that you just mentioned there, organizations are much more giving than we actually presume. So if you look at some of the statistics, the top 10 companies have given billions of dollars over the past couple of years. Corporate social responsibility is becoming a bigger thing. Companies like Microsoft and similar tech companies are also trying to give back. So this idea that, individuals that contribute on an individual level to give £5 or £10 here is what most of the sector is like, versus actual, corporations or entities or foundations that have large budgets are putting, a lot of money into this, and it's an imperative for them. Would you say that, it's 50-50 between individuals and corporations, or would you say corporations are sort of leading the charge on this, or foundations versus individuals?
By far and away, the biggest monetary flow in the whole sector are aid agencies. So UK aid, US aid, and so on. So actually, by far and away, they dwarf all giving. But I think you've touched upon a really good point, which is that companies can do good while doing well. And I think part of that is corporate social responsibility. Sometimes it's effective and sometimes it's not. But if you, the power of the Unilevers, the Procter & Gambles, the Nestlés of the world to do tremendous good through sustainable sourcing is really there. And I think, that's, an opportunity for the sector and an opportunity generally to help those companies have the most positive impact they can. Because compared to any giving flow, their commercial interactions are an order of magnitude larger.
I see. And so you mentioned that the biggest portion of the sector is UK aid and those types of organizations. Yeah. But the misconception here I'm thinking of is, most of the time the people that come from that particular realm are not business-minded people, or they don't have the necessary skills for the nonprofit versus profit sector. And so would you say that having a business mindset coming into the nonprofit world, be it from the corporations themselves or the individuals in terms of the talent and skill sets that they bring, is actually something that's relevant and needed in the nonprofit sector, or is it a completely different skill set, different way of thinking, different mode?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think certainly it's easy to have the conception, if you haven't worked in the nonprofit sector, that you've got a whole lot of lovey-doveys that don't really know what they're doing. And in fact, what you find are a lot of very dedicated, very professional, often incredibly well-qualified people working in the space. But I think just as the case is in any sector, you need a mix of skills. And I think especially with the rise of social enterprises, especially if you're going to work with companies to help improve their sourcing practices, for example, having a business mindset is really valuable. So yes, I think it's valuable. I do think I was cautioned when I moved across, coming from strategy consulting into the nonprofit world, not to assume that, as a business person, I'll just be able to sort it out with my wonderful skills. And the problems are far more complex and entrenched than that. That, really this needs a lot of levers to be pulled by a lot of very skilled people.
That makes perfect sense. In terms of one thing I just picked up on what you said there is in terms of the sourcing that you have to do in the nonprofit sector, it sounds like, you have to interact with many different partners, maybe a lot of different geographies. You have to go, into matrix organizations where there's different reporting structures. So there's quite a few different people you have to interact with there. And one of the things I'm just thinking about out loud is, there's a misconception there that nonprofits don't have to get involved with governments or politics or anything like that. They can just go in there, sort of save the day and, improve people's lives on the ground, right?
Yeah.
But there's a lot more to that. You actually have to engage with the local governments. You have to engage with, the actual individuals, as you call them, customers. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the need to do things that are not necessarily specifically related to the nonprofit sector, like get involved with politics or seeing them as a customer and things of that nature.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think the politics are unavoidable. Taking a step back for just a moment, but it's worth saying that you can help now or you can help in the future. Humanitarian work and development work, and the way that you engage with politicians and with communities is different in each of them, because if you're coming into, say, a drought relief situation with food parcels, how much you need to engage with whom, maybe you'll need to work with the local politicians, the national politicians, to ensure that you can get supply to the area that you're, if it's a conflict zone, that you'll get, whatever protection is feasible, and, you'll also be there on the watch out for corruption. But your engagement with the customer, the consumer, the recipient will be primarily transactional. But if you're trying to work on development, so say you're working with cooperatives. I was visiting a project working with a lake that had been historically overfished, and the NGO was working with the local fishermen to make sure there's sustainable sourcing and sustainable offtake. So you understand how much fish you can harvest, that you keep within that the proceeds are shared, and then over time that you reinvest the profits from one year. Say you're getting ripped off by a middleman who's charging extortionate prices to take the product to Kigali. They take the profit and they preserve a portion of that. This is the cooperative, not the NGO, and then invest that in a truck so that they can now transport their fish to market and get the additional premium. And that, is a multi-year engagement with this fishing cooperative to improve their operations, to improve their management of the lake, as well as their financial, the profit that they're making And that's sort of notwithstanding that there's, significant sections of the NGO community that work on advocacy, which is essentially the realization that compared to government flows, even aid flows are tiny. The things that are bigger than all the philanthropic flows, the aid flows are small compared to government flows. And so if you can improve the government's delivery of services, shift it, say, from maybe a subsidy on petrol to nutritional programming in the health sector so that women of childbearing age, young mothers get nutritional supplementation consistent with a healthy pregnancy and young child, early childhood years, that could do a huge amount of good. So there are a lot of organizations that focus squarely on trying to influence and improve government government flows.
That makes sense. One of the things I picked up on what you just said is it sounds like when you engage with the governments, it's an attempt to have a more long-term, sustainable, real strategic driven way to improve people's lives, right? So there's a development aspect of it. And you put it the right way as well. There's a sort of humanitarian emergency, we need to drop food, but there's also a longer term sort of, turning the ship around and making sure that it's going in the right direction as opposed to just the immediate quick spurt, which is what most people have in terms of a conception regarding nonprofits, right? People go in there, you think of Sudan or places that are really bad, and people go in there and just drop food. But there's a whole development aspect of it as well, which is the sustainable, long-term, strategic, government engaging portion of things. Why do you think there is that misconception out there that it's mostly just humanitarian and just let's go drop food and whatnot? Is that because that's what we see on the TV and, the kid on, the fly on their face and the typical imagery that we get from the sector?
Absolutely. It's hugely salient. I mean, it was fascinating. I was out in Ethiopia recently and, my image of Ethiopia prior to going had been set by the famine. Clearly it was a defining image of a generation. And you get there and it's incredibly lush, beautiful agricultural lands. And, most because of population growth, actually the majority of Ethiopians have been born after the famine. And yet, what is it? I don't know the exact number, 25 years later, I want to say, that's still the memory we have. So I think those are incredibly powerful images. They're very heavily marketed. And for retail philanthropy, you are my personal giving. They're going to be the images that get the most donations. And not unreasonably so. The development game's tough and it's littered with a lot of failures. Like, the classic image is one of a well that is drilled and then sort of 6-9 months later is already rusted up or, dry. So it requires a sustained focus of attention and resources and an acceptance that not every project will go well. And governments are better placed than individual retail givers, usually, for achieving that. Now, there are obviously notable exceptions. The Gates Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, to give it its full title, clearly are focused very squarely, especially in health, but across a number of sectors, in trying to make long-term, permanent, sustained changes. And, certainly, a number of foundations, such as the one I work for, are similarly focused in having a long-term impact.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I mean, at the end of the day, we're not just trying to solve something now and then. We're trying to, change people's lives. And, there's been a lot of good work that's been done over the past 10, 20 years to take a lot of people out of poverty. Indeed. A lot of people still think that nowadays, if you were to ask them how many people earn X amount of dollars a day or how many girls are being educated, the vast consensus is that the world is still a very bad place because maybe we're in the West here, we're in a bubble or whatnot. But going back to your point about, the imagery that we see out here and the misconceptions about how bad the world actually is and how much we've, actually improved it through the things you're doing at nonprofits and whatnot. Could you speak a little bit about how much better the world is than, we actually might think at first. Because you said you went to Ethiopia and you saw there was actually in some ways better than you anticipated before you went there. So are there any numbers or statistics or anything that, gives you hope in the morning and actually lets you go to work?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the history of aid, I think, has been one where a lot of people have got very despondent, myself certainly too, and a lot of people just sort of throw up their hands and go, we can't make an impact. And I think that pessimism leads to bad decision making, because if you assume nothing can be done, you try nothing. So, I think you raised the number of girls in education. I think the number is 90%. But the book that you absolutely, if this is a topic of any interest to you, the book you must read, and I'm trying to remember the title, it's Hans Rosling's book.
Factfulness?
Factfulness. Oh, spectacular. Yeah. Just a spectacular book. And if you don't have time for his book, some of the YouTube videos that he does are just, some of the most enjoyable statistics you've ever watched, which, is a sentence that doesn't really, grok, but somehow does. So he's fantastic. The story that we all know the climate's going to shit. We know that we've got a huge crisis on our hands. And I think there is, given how big the problem is, the human tendency is to go all ostrich about it and stick our heads in the sand. And assume that all the animals, every animal that isn't an urban fox is going, or pigeon is going to be wiped out. But I'm going to get it wrong, but I think it was a southern white rhino. It was hunted to near extinction, down to 200 animals alive on the planet, and they, small breeding herds were kept preserved. And there's, over the last, I think, 30, 40 years, we're now at 20,000.
Wow.
Southern white rhinos.
That's incredible. So
the ability of conservation efforts to protect and return species, is proven. We've done it. With the mountain gorillas that famously Dian Fossey worked to study and protect are now, their numbers are on the rise. I think they're up to 1,000 from 600 individuals previously. So we can, with concerted effort, turn the tide, and we should try.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, those are some great success stories that are out there, but maybe not many people know about. And, that's a perception problem as well. But something that comes to mind is, there are a million things you could be investing your time and resources into, right? So with the rhinos, that is a success story. And, people had to make a concerted effort and a framework as to why we're going to tackle this problem, why it's important, and decide to actually apply resources into it. Because if I was to, think about it from the outside looking in, a lot of people think nonprofits are wasteful. They're sort of indiscriminatory in terms of where they spend their money because maybe there's less accountability and things of that nature. But how do you decide on what problems to solve and how to actually deploy capital to get some of these amazing success stories that you're talking about?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think there is an answer for what we as a foundation do with a dedicated staff looking at it and what a retail organization can do. For us, it's a confluence of a few factors. It's things that are within our mandate. We have a focus given to us by our donor. And so we're looking for things that fall within that. There's another circle about what needs to get done. There are problems. There are many problems in the world, and you need to focus on ones that you can reasonably make some movement on. The real question about why now. And then there's a third element of cost effectiveness, understanding what the benefit to cost ratio is of what you do. So we will, my background was working in private equity for a strategy consultancy, and similar to what we do there, if we're doing an impact investment, we understand the financial return. If it's a grant, there is none. But we also understand the impacts that we're having, give or take, and clearly subject to risk. And we look at and total up. Okay, we're going to save this many animals, or we're going to protect this much bushland, or we're expecting that we're going to make this much food available to this many individuals. And we, take that, we divide it by the amount of money we've given, and then we've got some benchmarks published. Copenhagen Consensus will give you, a fairly large raft of benchmarks on what benefit to cost returns you can expect, and we go, does that meet the threshold or not? So it's really a combination of those three factors. I think the other element that's particular to us is that we really believe in the power of having an effective organization that we are helping to grow. There is a tendency to want to create everything from scratch, to be the person who said, I invented this or I solved this problem. And the truth is that I think a lot of problems have already been partly solved, or someone out there is doing some really good work. And actually the most efficient use of resources is to help them do more of what they're doing than to try to find someone who's going to perfect it, because that perfection is very elusive. So I think, it takes, humility on the part of our donor to be prepared to do that. But I think it's a real, it's a really effective, it's the right thing to do. When dealing with an individual, I think this is really interesting, but there's a whole school of thought called effective altruism, which is we have the science and we have the knowledge to understand what is the benefit of giving a child a deworming tablet at age 5? How does that compare to a mosquito bed net? How does that compare to a dose of antibiotics? How does that compare to an extra year of schooling? As delivered through, a teacher training model. We have this, and there's some folk over at GiveWell are probably the most consumer-friendly and most, fully digested version of this information. But you can log onto their website and they're like, if you want to give some money, here is the way to have the most impact on the most number of people per dollar. You've got to apply your own value judgment for that, because, implicit in any such ranking is like, well, we the sanctity of human life. And you go, well, how does that compare to an elephant's life? Like, that's not a decision anyone can put in an Excel spreadsheet and give you an answer. But I think they're probably the most thoughtful people on the topic. And, as I said, you can just log on their website. They have checked out the charities in terms of how much money they spend on overheads, whether they get the job done, whether there's any evidence that what they're doing works. They make it so easy. So I'd encourage you to have a look at them.
One of the things you mentioned that stands out to me, so you mentioned the words, humility, altruism. What is the benefit of, saving a human life versus an elephant life? These are very emotional or empathetic topics or things that are not necessarily considered. I just want to touch a little bit more on that, because, the nonprofit sector is something that will stress your, or should I say strain your emotions. I mean, you're going to some really difficult situations, and then maybe going back to a developed world and then having to, see things that most people wouldn't see, or deal with things that most people wouldn't deal with. So I want to just talk a bit about the empathy portion of things, or the caring, or how you navigate the emotional side of working in this space. Because for the most part, we all assume that it's people that are very soft-hearted that want to do this kind of work, or either some people might think you have to have, nerves of steel to be able to go into these places. But from your perspective, what does the emotional side entail, and how do you navigate that as you work in this industry?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I don't think I have any particular superhuman abilities. I think it's interesting. I was reflecting, ahead of talking to you, what do I like about working in a foundation and what do I not? And one of the tough parts of my role is I have to say no more often than I say yes. Because, you have the multiple lenses and you can see things that absolutely ought to be done, but it's not your bailiwick. It's not for you to do. And that can be quite tough, especially when you know that these NGOs have put a lot of effort into what they're doing. They really believe in it. They're doing good work, but for whatever reason, it doesn't match the criteria that you apply. So I have all the respect in the world for our implementation partners, for the operating NGOs, the delivery NGOs who are out there day in, day out, helping kids who have got malaria and giving them the right treatment, etc. And also, a lot of those times operating with nowhere near the level of resources that they should. the idea that you come back and live this fantastic life that we do in London, knowing how many people, are suffering for want of a course of amoxicillin is just, it's very tough. It certainly encouraged me to give more giving out of my own private income, although it's, obviously a fraction of it's nothing compared to, resources that the large donors can give. But I think you have to do that, I think, because otherwise you're not consistent with your own values.
In terms of, those are excellent points. It's my family members work in nonprofit sectors as well, and I see them have to navigate that emotional turmoil, have a different perspective on life when they go to developing countries versus living in the West or developed countries as well. And oftentimes I see that they have, life in perspective. They appreciate things that we have. They appreciate the sanctity of human life. It just gives them a different viewpoint into the way the world operates, right? Is there anything you've learned about yourself or about humanity working in the nonprofit sector versus when you worked in the business world? And the reason why I ask is, for myself, working in a business environment, in the for-profit environment, I've understood the way the world works sometimes, right? We have to make money. We have to, play the game of politics sometimes, and numbers do matter and things of that nature. But I've never actually worked in the nonprofit, so I haven't been warped to think about the world in a different way. How has your development from the for-profit to the nonprofit changed your reality or view of the world in terms of day to day, but also just in the grand scheme of things?
Yeah, it's a good question. So my career has been bouncing in and out of the nonprofit space. As I mentioned before, I started my career working in healthcare analytics, working with hospitals across Australia and New Zealand to improve quality and efficiency. And I say that because, probably my first experiences were in the nonprofit, and then I moved to, strategy consultancy, private equity, to the heart of modern capitalism. And I think it's easy in the nonprofit space to demonize companies, and I think one area where I think there are a lot of gain could be made, as we were mentioning earlier, is helping companies do their work in a more ethical and a more sustainable fashion. And in fact, I'd argue for people who have had a significant career in the private sector and are thinking about moving to the nonprofit sector, actually ask yourself, can you do more good where you are by influencing the companies you work for, rather than trying, shifting it all, losing all that skills, all that political capital, all that career capital, and moving into another sector where there are already quite a few people working. So I think having jumped across from nonprofit to for-profit, I think a greater understanding that companies aren't evil. I think having jumped back recently, I think the amount of life satisfaction you can derive from living, a life that is, I don't live a bad life. London is a phenomenal city to live in, but also know that I'm using what I've learned to make the world a little bit better. That's a fantastic combination. And I came from lunch with former colleagues and people I've worked with in the past, and there is a sense of satisfaction with the choices I've made that I think not obvious, because you do step away from the same salary and progression and status, frankly, that you can get from succeeding in the business world. In the nonprofit world.
Yeah, there are two things that stand out to me that you said there. So life satisfaction, right? It seems to, go up if you work in the nonprofit. Well, not all of them, but in some regards it can go up. But you don't necessarily have to sacrifice your living standards, at least to that degree that most people think you have to. Obviously, it depends on what organization you work for. It depends on the level of funding available. There's so many different factors there. But in terms of actually living a decent lifestyle. You mentioned you live in London, right? You have a pretty good life for the most part, not just from a business or compensation perspective, but from a life satisfaction perspective. And I think most people would agree, or they have that intuition that, of course, when your life satisfaction will go up because you're actually making a difference and change in the world. But let's talk a little bit about the misconception that there are sort of no good paying roles in the nonprofit, or it really is everyone on a shoestring budget and whatnot. Would you say that's a fair?
It's not easy. You take a hit, and I was lucky in some of my early career that I have a little bit of a nest egg and therefore some financial security, which helped to make the move. I maybe wouldn't have if that hadn't been the case. I don't want to give anyone the sense that it's a well compensated career. But also I think this question of life satisfaction, it's not that life satisfaction is derived from working in a non-profit. I think you'd be very satisfied working in the for-profit sector, and I certainly have been in my career. I think it's the satisfaction, it comes from living a life consistent with your values. And I think if there's a calculation that you need to do that says if you want to do good in the world, the best way to do it might be to stay in the private sector and give a significant portion of your salary to specialists who are working day in, day out, tirelessly, improving people's lives, whether that's in healthcare, whether that's in animal conservation, or take your pick. And that should be just as satisfying as it is going into the nonprofit sector. I think the nonprofit sector is tough because that dependence on the wheel of fundraising, that rat wheel of fundraising, hamster wheel of fundraising.
Rat race? I don't know.
Yeah, probably. That's a tough place to be and can distract you from doing the direct delivery that I think a lot of people are in the game for. And I think the other element of life satisfaction is doing something you're good at and are appreciated for. And you've got to ask yourself, if you're coming across, do you have skills that would be useful? You maybe want to help, baby elephants in Kenya.
It seemed to like baby elephants a lot, huh?
Yeah, I visited the Sheldrick Wildlife Trust 2 weeks ago, so they are front of mind for me. That was on a personal day. But maybe actually, I used to work in healthcare, and actually maybe a better thing for you to do, like if you're really good at accounting, well, the NHS always needs accountants. And actually you can be comfortable that you're supporting, a phenomenal British institution here and using your skills rather than trying to start a whole new different career. So I think I just wanted to sort of respond to that idea that life satisfaction necessarily gets better because you work at a non-profit. And I just don't think that's the case. I think, a fair amount of people are incredibly satisfied, and a fair amount of people are frustrated with how tough the game can be.
Yeah, it definitely is a tough game. I mean, I have family members that work in it every day, and it's not as easy or as rosy as they make it seem, right? Yeah. It is a tough situation to be in from a personal perspective. It will challenge your perspective on life. Yeah. There is obviously, the compensation aspect of things you have to deliberate for yourself. But again, I think it goes back to the point that you mentioned. It's about the values you have, and is the work you're doing consistent with those values? And are you providing the most value that you can personally based on your skill set? I think those are excellent points to touch on. But thanks so much for joining the show. Just as a final thing to wrap up with, a bit about yourself or a message that you'd like to get out there to people, more about, what it is you do and what you're passionate about, or any message you'd like to get out there in particular?
Oh, wow. Tough question. No, I just hope people have got a book for Christmas. I hope people are taking some of the downtime to read and learn about an element of life for the world that is unfamiliar to them. I think society could do quite well at the moment if we all just stopped to listen to the other side. Yeah.
Well, that makes the most sense. Thanks so much for joining us today. And we'll definitely keep in touch, and hopefully we hear some more good news out of the work that you're doing.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Cheers.